Lacan was a French psychoanalyst whose ideas have greatly influenced literary theory. He started his career in medicine and psychiatry in the 1920s, focusing on mental illnesses like paranoia. In 1936, he introduced his famous mirror stage theory, which explains how infants first begin to understand themselves as separate beings by recognizing their own image in the mirror. Lacan's thinking was shaped by key figures in French intellectual life, including anthropologist Lévi-Strauss and linguists Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jakobson. By the 1950s, he started challenging traditional psychoanalysis. In a 1955 speech in Vienna, Lacan argued that psychoanalysts should return to Freud's original ideas not by focusing on the conscious mind, the ego, but by paying attention to the unconscious mind, which he called the nucleus of our being. This view was controversial and led to his expulsion from the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1959. In 1964, he started his own school in Paris and began publishing his lectures in a book called Écritus. Lacan's seminars were intense theatrical events. He spoke in a dramatic, unpredictable style, often sounding more like a performer than a lecturer. His talks were not traditional explanations but rather deep, often mysterious reflections, which made his writing difficult to understand. His students felt that he was speaking directly to them in a coded way, as if he were guiding them through a kind of initiation. Lacan once said that the only real teaching is the kind you can only understand in its own terms, which explains why his work can feel strange at first. Literary critics are more interested in a few specific Lacanian texts, including The Insistence of the Letter in the Unconscious, where Lacan connects language with the unconscious mind. His seminar on Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, where he explores how stories reflect psychological truths. His seminar on Shakespeare's Hamlet, where he analyzes how desire shapes human actions. In The Insistence of the Letter, Lacan argues that language is central to psychoanalysis. He says that psychoanalysis is really a science of language and that the unconscious is not just random thoughts or hidden feelings but a structured system much like a language. He famously said the unconscious is structured like a language. What does this mean? Lacan builds on Saussure's idea that language is based on relationships between words, not between words and things in the real world. For example, two identical bathroom doors labeled ladies and gentlemen show how the same thing can take on two different meanings based on context. So, meaning in language is never fixed, it constantly shifts. Lacan calls this the sliding of the signified under the signifier, meaning that words never point directly to stable meanings. This idea leads to a radical conclusion. Language does not mirror reality, it creates its own world. This fits with post-structuralist thinking, which often questions fixed meanings and stable truths. Lacan supports his view on the unconscious by linking it to two ideas from Freud, condensation and displacement, both found in dreams. These match the linguistic concepts of metaphor and metonymy. Displacement, like metonymy, is one thing that stands for something else, like a part representing the whole. In dreams, person might be represented by a related object, like an Italian lover shown as Alfa Romeo. Second, condensation, like metaphor, where many ideas are combined into one image or symbol, like a ship being compared to a plow cutting through waves. The unconscious works through language. When people speak, especially in dreams or slips of the tongue, they use wordplay, puns, and double meanings, all signs that the unconscious speaks through language. Lacan then challenges traditional Western ideas of the self. While philosophers like Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," Lacan reverses it. "I am where I think not." He means that the true self lies in the unconscious, the part of the mind we don't control. This leads to the idea that the self is not a stable, unified being, but something split, shaped by language and hidden desires. The self is not a solid entity, but a linguistic construction. Language comes before we are even born. It is already there shaping us. Therefore, there is no pure, unique soul. This undermines the liberal humanist idea that each person has a stable identity. This view has major effects on how we read literature. If the self is unstable, then fictional characters are not realistic people either. They are just clusters of language, signifiers attached to a name. That means we should read characters not as real people with psychology, but as parts of a text shaped by language. Lacan's theory also changes how we view literary realism. Realist novels assume that they reflect the real world, but if language doesn't connect directly to reality, as Lacan says, then realism is an illusion. Instead, we might value modernist or postmodernist texts which play language and form rather than trying to present a realistic story. These texts often refer to other texts, break the fourth wall, or draw attention to their own structure. One of Lacan's most famous ideas is the mirror stage. This is when a baby around 16 to 18 months old sees itself in a mirror and starts to form an identity. Before this, the child lives in what Lacan calls the imaginary, a world of unity closely connected to the mother. After the mirror stage, the child enters the symbolic order, the world of language, rules, and separation. This is also where social norms and influence of the father come in. Language, in Lacan's view, is based on absence and loss. It replaces the real thing with a symbol. In literature, the symbolic is seen in traditional logical realist texts, structured and orderly. The imaginary, in contrast, appears in experimental writing that breaks rules and explores emotions, dreams, and fantasy. Great literature, according to Lacanian critics, often blends the two. It lets the imaginary break through the symbolic. A good example is the work of British author B.S. Johnson, who wrote novels where characters argue with the author or comment on the plot. What Lacanian critics do? Like Freudian critics, Lacanian critics focus on hidden motives and feelings, but instead of exploring the authors or characters as unconscious, they look for the unconscious meaning within the text itself. They search for deep, often conflicting layers of meaning that exist beneath the surface message of the work. This process is also known as deconstruction. Lacanian critics also look for signs in a story that match key ideas from Lacan's theories, like the mirror stage or the power of the unconscious mind. They examine how themes such as desire and lack shape the story. They see literature as a reflection of Lacan's ideas about language and the unconscious, especially the idea that words never fully capture what they mean and that the unconscious plays a central role in shaping meaning. Because of this, they often prefer experimental or anti-realist texts that question traditional storytelling. To show how Lacanian theory can be applied to literature, we can look at Lacan's famous reading of Edgar Allan Poe's detective story, The Purloined Letter. Lacan discussed the story in a series of lectures for psychoanalysts in training. These discussions later inspired many post-structuralist critics in the 1980s, and several essays on the topic were collected in the Purloined Poe. Feldman wrote about it in her essay in Theory into Practice. Since this interpretation is by Lacan himself, it clearly shows how he sees literature as a way to express his own views on language and psychoanalysis. Poe's story fits well with psychoanalytic theory because it has symbolic, almost dreamlike quality. The characters are not deeply developed, instead, they seem more like chess pieces in a strategic game of deception. The main characters include the queen, the king, the minister, the chief of police, and Dupin, the detective. The story can be broken into 4 parts. First, the minister sees the queen trying to hide a letter from the king, who enters suddenly. Knowing she cannot hide it without drawing attention, she leaves it on the desk. The minister steals it and replaces it with a similar looking one. Second, the queen realizes the theft and asks the chief of police to search the minister's home, but they find nothing even after a thorough investigation. Third, the queen then turns to Dupin. He figures that the letter must be in plain sight, not hidden, since that's the only way the minister could keep it safe and accessible. Dupin spots it tucked about the fireplace, among other papers. Fourth, Dupin returns, creates a distraction, and replaces the letter with a fake. The queen gets her letter back, and the minister, not knowing it's gone, is ultimately exposed. Dupin uses a note inside the fake letter as payback for a past wrong. Lacan's reading of the story is very different from traditional Freudian interpretations, like that of Mary Bonaparte. Bonaparte, a follower of Freud, believed Poe's stories were expressions of his own psychological issues. For example, she saw themes of obsession with death and a fixation on his mother in his writing. She focused on the author's personal life. Lacan, on the other hand, does not look at Poe as a person. Instead, he treats the story as a metaphor that reveals how the unconscious and work. He makes 3 points. First, the stolen letter represents the unconscious. We never learn what the letter says, but it influences everyone's actions. In the same way, the unconscious affects behavior even though its exact contents remain unknown. Second, Dupin's actions mimic how a psychoanalysis works. In therapy, patients repeat and retell painful memories. The spoken version replaces the hidden memory, helping the person heal. Similarly, Dupin solves the mystery by repeating the theft and replacing the letter again. Third, the letter also represents language itself. In Lacan's view, words, that is, signifiers, do not directly connect to meanings, signifieds. Like the letter in the story, language always hides something. We can describe things, but we never fully reveal their essence. This comparison shows how Lacanian analysis moves away from looking at the author's psychology and focuses instead on how texts reflect deeper truths about language and the unconscious.